In this lecture, we will discuss how to use subprocedures in Visual Basic.
A subprocedure is simply a set or series of Visual Basic statements that's enclosed by the sub and end sub keywords. Now, this is also known as methods and also sometimes known as subs. And we've already seen some examples of subprocedures. So let me give you an example here. You should be familiar with this subprocedure by now, where we would have a subprocedure called form1load. And as we remember, this particular method or sub is automatically called whenever we start our application because it handles the event mybase.load. What we're going to be looking at in this lecture is the fact that we can actually write our own subprocedures. So we want to look at how we would actually create these subprocedures. I mean, obviously we have the sub and end sub keywords, but we'll take a look at everything we need to know about how to actually write these subprocedures or methods in Visual Basic. Now, a subprocedure is very similar to a function, and you might think that they're one and the same, but that's not true with respect to Visual Basic. The key difference between subprocedures and functions is that a function must return something, whereas a subprocedure doesn't return anything. Okay? Functions must return something, whether it's an integer or a double or a string, but functions always return something. Subprocedures do not return anything. The best way to describe it is think of a sub like a void method or void function in other programming languages like C, C++, or Java. Okay, so the key difference, functions return something, subs do not. Subs are more like void methods or functions. Here is the layout for a sub procedure. So we can say private sub and then the name of the sub, and then we have parentheses, and then we'd have the list of parameters. There could be no parameters, but it just depends on what the sub procedure is. And then we would have the set of statements that comes afterwards, and then we would end with end sub. That's really all there is to it. It's nothing different from what we've seen in previous examples. We just make sure we have our heading correctly, and we have end sub at the end, and what comes between would be our statements. Here's an example of a sub procedure. So the name of this sub procedure is write labels. So we see the name is given right here. And then we have two parameters. Now I couldn't fit this all in one line, so it's on two separate lines. But we have a parameter called string1, which is designated as a string because we can see str1 as string. And then our second parameter is str2, which is also a string. And then we have the body of the method right here. I included a space right after the method heading or the sub procedure heading, just so you know what is actually part of the heading of the sub and what is the body of the sub. So we see here that we're going to set the text for some label, which we call label 1, to whatever the string str1 has. And then the text for label 2 is going to be the string that's stored in str2 in this case. And then we conclude with end sub. The first line of a sub is called the header. And this basically contains the properties of our sub. This is no different than any of the functions or methods we've seen in other programming languages. So this would include things like the access modifiers, whether it's public or private. This would contain the name of the sub. This would include the parentheses, the parameters, the names of the parameters, how many, any modifiers associated with them, but everything that's considered that first line of a sub would be our header. We just mentioned that the header of a sub contains access modifiers. Well, what are those? An access modifier just simply dictates where the sub can be used. In this case, we have two options for access modifiers. We have public, which means that the sub can be used or called outside of the class that's defined in. And then we have private, which just simply means that the sub can be used only within that class. In other words, no other class, or I should say objects of other classes, are allowed to access or call a private sub. So if we go back to our write labels example, the sub that we had just before, we saw that the access modifier for it was private. which means it cannot be used outside of that particular class. It can only be used within that class. We also mentioned that subs have parameters. A parameter is just simply a pre-declared variable that we can use inside of subs. The way I usually explain it is, think of a parameter as just this free variable that's already given to us, it's already declared, and then we can just use it inside the body of our sub in this case. Now, parameters are provided inside the parentheses of the header. So we saw in our earlier example that we had two different parameters, if I remember correctly. We had two strings, str1 and str2. So we know what the parameters are by looking in the parentheses, and we can see how many parameters because they're separated by commas, and we can know the names, the types, and so forth. And what these parameters do is they allow us to pass values into the sub. So whenever we call or invoke a sub, because we have our definition, we still have to call the actual sub, we can pass values to that sub, and they would be stored in those parameters. So just like in other programming languages, I can call a method, I would have some arguments, and then we can think of the values of those arguments being copied and stored into the parameters of our method definition. The same thing is true for parameters of a sub in Visual Basic. Now, there is one other thing about parameters that we haven't talked about. There are actually two types of parameters in Visual Basic. We have what are called by-val and by-ref parameters. And you may have noticed that in our earlier example with the write labels method, that string 1 had the word by-val in front of it, and string 2 also had the word by-val from it. And we haven't really talked about what those are yet. We're going to go ahead and take care of that now. We'll start by talking about by-val parameters. Well, a by-val parameter just simply stores the value that is passed into the sub, and only the value into that sub. In other words, we're just making a copy of the value and storing it in the parameter. This means if we make any changes to the parameters in our sub, they have no effect on anything outside of the sub. So let me give you an example to help demonstrate this. Let's say we have a variable x, and let's say that stores the value 5. And let's suppose we pass x into a sub. So let's say we have a sub, and we call that sub, and x is one of the arguments. So what we're going to do is we copy the value 5 into a parameter of that sub, and let's say that parameter changes the value to 6. Well, what happens to x is it's still 5. We don't make any changes to the actual argument. The change only comes to, the change only comes to the parameter. It does not have any effect in the argument at all. In our earlier example, as I mentioned just a minute ago, both string 1 and string 2 in our earlier example were by-val parameters. And what that means is only the values of the strings were passed into the sub. If we made any changes to str1 or str2, they would have no impact on the strings that were actually being passed to those parameters. Now, by-ref parameters are very different. These parameters directly access a variable that was passed to our sub. So we're no longer copying the value from the argument to the parameter. We're actually accessing the argument that was being passed. And what this means is if we make a change to the by-ref parameter in our sub, it will change the variable that was passed to the sub. So to help illustrate this, let's say we go back to our earlier example where we have x being a variable that's initially 5, and let's say we pass that into our sub, and the parameter was a by-ref parameter. When that parameter becomes 6, x now becomes 6. So when this sub is done and we go back to the procedure that called that sub, x is now 6 because our parameter was a by-ref parameter.